Vietnam, a country in Southeast Asia, has a long and complex history. For centuries, it faced foreign powers seeking to control its land and people. In the 19th century, France colonized Vietnam, exploiting its resources and people for its benefit. This colonization sowed the seeds of resistance and the desire for independence among the Vietnamese. After World War II, as colonial powers weakened, Vietnam saw an opportunity for freedom. Ho Chi Minh, a charismatic leader who had spent years fighting for his country's independence, emerged as a key figure. He led the Viet Minh, a communist-led organization, in their struggle against the French. The First Indochina War from 1946 to 1954 witnessed fierce fighting between the Viet Minh and the French. The decisive Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954 marked a turning point. The Viet Minh's victory forced the French to negotiate, leading to the Geneva Accords and the end of French colonialism in Indochina. The Geneva Accords of 1954 temporarily divided Vietnam into two zones: the communist-led Democratic Republic of Vietnam, or North Vietnam, under Ho Chi Minh, and the State of Vietnam, or South Vietnam, which was initially intended to be a non-communist state. However, this division was not meant to be permanent. Elections were supposed to be held in 1956 to reunify the country. The United States, deeply entrenched in the Cold War and fearful of the domino theory, the idea that if one country fell to communism, others in the region would follow, stepped in to support South Vietnam. The US saw South Vietnam as a crucial buffer state against the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. Ngo Dinh Diem, a staunch anti-communist, became the leader of South Vietnam. However, Diem's government faced significant internal problems. He was authoritarian, corrupt, and alienated many South Vietnamese with his policies, particularly his persecution of Buddhists. This created an environment ripe for dissent and rebellion. As Diem's government struggled to maintain control, a communist insurgency began to take root in South Vietnam. The National Liberation Front, also known as the Viet Cong, emerged as a guerrilla force fighting against the South Vietnamese government and their American allies. The stage was set for a long and bloody conflict. The United States' involvement in Vietnam escalated gradually throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s. Initially, the US provided military advisors and financial aid to South Vietnam. However, as the situation deteriorated and the Viet Cong gained strength, the US commitment deepened. In 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident occurred, in which North Vietnamese torpedo boats allegedly attacked US destroyers. This incident, though later disputed, provided the pretext for the US Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, authorizing President Lyndon B. Johnson to escalate US military involvement in Vietnam. With the resolution in place, US combat troops were deployed to Vietnam in large numbers. The American public, largely unaware of the complexities of the conflict, initially supported the war effort. However, as the war dragged on and casualties mounted, public opinion began to shift. The Vietnam War was unlike any war the United States had fought before. The dense jungles and unfamiliar terrain of Vietnam presented significant challenges for the US military, which was accustomed to conventional warfare. The Viet Cong, on the other hand, were masters of guerrilla warfare, utilizing hit-and-run tactics, booby traps, and an intricate network of tunnels to their advantage. The US military relied heavily on its technological superiority, deploying bombers, helicopters, and napalm in an attempt to crush the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army. However, these tactics often resulted in heavy civilian casualties and widespread destruction, further alienating the Vietnamese population and fueling anti-war sentiment. The war took a heavy toll on both sides. American soldiers, often young and unprepared for the brutality of the conflict, faced death, injury, and psychological trauma. Vietnamese civilians were caught in the crossfire, their lives and livelihoods shattered by the fighting. Section 5, the Tet Offensive, a turning point. In January 1968, during the Vietnamese New Year holiday of Tet, the Viet Cong and NVA launched a massive coordinated attack across South Vietnam. The Tet Offensive, as it became known, targeted major cities, military installations, and government buildings, including the US Embassy in Saigon. Although the Tet Offensive was a military defeat for the Communists, it proved to be a turning point in the war. The attacks, which contradicted optimistic claims by the US government that the war was nearing its end, shocked the American public and eroded support for the war effort. The Tet Offensive exposed the credibility gap between the Johnson administration's portrayal of the war and the reality on the ground. It demonstrated the resilience and determination of the communist forces, and it fueled growing anti-war protests across the United States. Section 6. Nixon's War, Vietnamization and Withdrawal. Richard Nixon was elected president in 1968 on a platform of peace with honor in Vietnam. His strategy involved a policy of Vietnamization, which aimed to gradually withdraw US troops from Vietnam while simultaneously strengthening the South Vietnamese military to fight the communists on their own. As part of his Vietnamization policy, Nixon authorized the secret bombing of Cambodia and Laos, hoping to disrupt communist supply lines and weaken the enemy. However, these bombings, which caused widespread civilian casualties and destabilized the region, further escalated the conflict and sparked outrage at home. Despite the escalation of the war, Nixon continued to pursue peace negotiations with North Vietnam. In 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, officially ending US involvement in the Vietnam War. However, the accords failed to address the underlying political divisions in Vietnam, and fighting between North and South Vietnam continued. Section 7. The Fall of Saigon, a Nation Divided. After the US withdrawal from Vietnam, the South Vietnamese government, weakened by corruption, internal divisions, and the loss of American support, struggled to hold back the communist forces. In 1975, the North Vietnamese army launched a final offensive, quickly overrunning South Vietnam. On April 30th, 1975, NVA tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon, effectively ending the Vietnam War. The fall of Saigon, which was renamed Ho Chi Minh City, marked the reunification of Vietnam under communist rule. The fall of Saigon was a chaotic and tragic event for many South Vietnamese who had supported the US-backed government. Fearing communist reprisals, thousands fled the country in a mass exodus, seeking refuge in the United States and other countries. Section 8. Scars of War, the Enduring Legacy of Vietnam. The Vietnam War left an indelible mark on both Vietnam and the United States. The war had a devastating human cost, with millions of Vietnamese civilians and soldiers killed, along with over 58,000 American service members. In Vietnam, the war's legacy is still felt today. The country faces the ongoing challenges of rebuilding its infrastructure, healing the wounds of war, and addressing the environmental damage caused by Agent Orange, a powerful herbicide used by the US military. The Vietnam War also had a profound impact on American society. The war divided the nation, eroded trust in the government, and sparked a wave of anti-war sentiment. It also led to a reassessment of US foreign policy and a reluctance to engage in future military interventions. Section 9. Reflections on a Divided Nation. The Vietnam War was a complex and tragic conflict with far-reaching consequences. It was a war that tested the limits of American power and resolve, and it left an enduring legacy of loss, division, and questioning. The war also highlighted the importance of understanding history, the dangers of unchecked power, and the need for empathy and compassion for all those affected by conflict. It serves as a reminder of the human cost of war and the importance of pursuing peace. The Vietnam War, though a painful chapter in both Vietnamese and American history, offers valuable lessons about the need for dialogue, understanding, and reconciliation. It reminds us that even in the darkest of times, hope for a more peaceful future must prevail.